In the scorching heat of Thebes, in the year 650 before Christ, 73 human beings vanished without a trace from the royal palace of Pharaoh Psamtik II. Not killed in battle, not struck down by plague, not executed in the public squares where crowds would gather to witness royal justice. They simply disappeared. The official record spoke of servants who had abandoned their duties and fled in cowardice as Assyrian armies marched toward the sacred city. But the truth was far more sinister than any scribe dared write on papyrus. These 73 souls had been swallowed by the very walls they had served within, chained in darkness beneath the marble floors where they once carried golden trays and burned sacred incense. Their crime was not theft, not blasphemy, not even treason in the traditional sense. Their crime was hope. Hope that freedom might come through betrayal. Hope that foreign conquerors might prove more merciful than their own divine ruler. Before we continue with the story of what became known as the Palace of Horrors, tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening from, and don't forget to subscribe to hear more untold stories from the shadows of ancient Egypt. What happened in those underground chambers would remain hidden for generations, but the whispers of palace guards and the nightmares of surviving witnesses would ensure that this tale of 73 chained souls would never truly die. The Egypt of 650 before Christ was a kingdom gasping for breath. The 26th dynasty ruled from the northern city of Sais, but their power over the ancient capital of Thebes remained tenuous at best. Pharaoh Psamtik II wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, yet his authority was constantly challenged by Assyrian forces pressing from the east and Nubian rebels stirring trouble to the south. In Thebes, the royal palace stood as a testament to faded glory. Its massive sandstone walls, carved with hieroglyphs praising the achievements of long-dead pharaohs, housed nearly 2,000 people. Nobles with their elaborate wigs and golden jewelry occupied the upper levels, their chambers cooled by servants who fanned them with ostrich feathers throughout the sweltering days. Below them lived the administrators, scribes, and military officers who kept the machinery of government functioning despite the chaos of constant warfare. But it was in the deepest levels of the palace, in chambers that rarely saw sunlight, where the real work was done. Here labored the servants whose names appeared on no royal inscriptions, whose faces were known to no court artists. They hauled water from the Nile in heavy clay jars, their shoulders permanently bent from years of carrying loads that would break lesser men. They ground grain in stone mills, their hands bleeding from the rough surfaces, their lungs filled with flour dust that turned their coughs into permanent reminders of their station. Among these forgotten souls lived men like Hamwaset, whose father had served in the same palace before him, and women like Neferet, who had been sold into service at age 12 when her family could no longer afford to feed her. They slept on reed mats in windowless rooms, ate barley bread and onions, and counted themselves fortunate if they received a cup of weak beer at the end of their 16-hour workdays. The palace hierarchy was as rigid as the stone columns that supported its halls. At the pinnacle sat Pharaoh Psamtik, believing himself to be the living incarnation of Horus, demanding absolute devotion from every soul under his rule. Beneath him, Vizier Amenemheb controlled the daily operations with an iron fist, his network of spies and informants ensuring that even the smallest whisper of dissent reached his ears within hours. The servants understood their place in this order. They had been taught from childhood that the pharaoh's divine nature made their servitude not just necessary, but sacred. To serve the god-king was to participate in maintaining the cosmic balance that kept the Nile flowing and the sun rising each morning. Rebellion was not just treason, it was a sin against the very foundations of existence. Yet even the most sacred bonds can crack under sufficient pressure. And in the autumn of 650 before Christ, that pressure was building to unbearable levels. Assyrian forces under King Ashurbanipal had conquered Memphis and were advancing steadily southward. Reports arrived daily of Egyptian cities falling, their populations enslaved or slaughtered. The palace servants, who cleaned the chambers where military briefings took place, who served wine to generals discussing desperate strategies, began to understand that their divine Pharaoh might not be as invincible as the temple priests proclaimed. In the servants' quarters, conversations that had once focused on the day's tasks and the quality of the evening meal began to shift toward more dangerous topics. What would happen if the Assyrians reached Thebes? Would they slaughter every Egyptian they found, as rumor suggested? Or might they prove more merciful to those who cooperated with their conquest? It was during one of these whispered discussions, in a storage room deep beneath the palace where grain was kept cool in large ceramic jars, that the first seeds of conspiracy were planted. The servants who gathered there could not have imagined that their desperate hope for freedom would lead 73 of their number into chains far heavier than any they had ever known. The conspiracy began not with grand speeches or elaborate planning, but with a simple observation made by a servant named Seneb, while emptying chamber pots in the palace's eastern wing. As he worked in the pre-dawn darkness, he noticed something that would change the fate of 73 lives. The guards posted at the palace's main entrance were being rotated more frequently, their shifts shortened from 8 hours to 4. More telling still, these guards appeared nervous, constantly scanning the horizon toward the north, where dust clouds suggested the movement of large armies. Seneb shared his observation with Kamwaset during the midday meal break, as they sat in the shade of a palm tree in the servants' courtyard. "The guards fear something," Seneb whispered, glancing around to ensure no overseer was within earshot. "They speak in hushed tones about evacuation plans for the royal family." Word of this discovery spread through the servant community like fire through dry papyrus. Within days, a core group of 73 individuals had formed around a shared realization. Their divine Pharaoh was preparing to abandon them to whatever fate the approaching Assyrians might decree. The revelation shattered their lifelong conditioning about royal loyalty and divine protection. The group included servants from every level of palace life. There was Katie, who maintained the royal gardens and had access to the palace's outer walls. Amentet worked in the kitchens and knew the schedules of food deliveries from outside suppliers. Jetptahufunk served as a messenger between different palace departments and understood the building's layout better than almost anyone else. Most crucially, they had Horus, a young scribe who could read and write, and who had access to official documents that revealed the true extent of Egypt's military weakness. Their plan, when it finally crystallized, was devastatingly simple. They would make contact with Assyrian scouts who were rumored to be operating in the area around Thebes. In exchange for information about palace defenses, guard rotations, and the pharaoh's personal schedule, they would negotiate safe passage out of Egypt and perhaps even positions in the Assyrian administration of conquered territories. Horus used his scribal privileges to create false documents authorizing various servants to travel outside the palace on official business. Over the course of 2 weeks, small groups of conspirators began making contact with Assyrian advance forces camped in the desert hills east of the city. The Assyrians, led by a commander named Nabu-Shum-Ukin, were initially suspicious, but quickly recognized the value of inside information about one of Egypt's most important strongholds. The negotiations proceeded smoothly. Too smoothly, as events would soon prove. The Assyrians agreed to spare the lives of all 73 conspirators in exchange for detailed intelligence about palace defenses. They promised that cooperative Egyptians would be given positions of authority in the new Assyrian administration of Thebes. Some conspirators would even be relocated to other parts of the Assyrian Empire, where their knowledge of Egyptian customs and language would make them valuable administrators. For men and women who had spent their entire lives as property of the pharaoh, these promises seemed like glimpses of paradise itself. They began to imagine lives where they worked for wages rather than mere survival, where their children might learn to read and write, where they might own small plots of land or modest homes of their own. But Vizier Amenemheb had not maintained power through decades of political turmoil by failing to notice unusual activity within his domain. His network of informants included servants who owed him personal favors, guards who supplemented their income by reporting suspicious behavior, and even some members of the conspiracy itself, who had been secretly working as double agents from the beginning. The trap was sprung on a night when the conspirators believed themselves closest to freedom. They had arranged to meet with their Assyrian contacts at an abandoned temple complex 2 miles from the palace. As they made their way through the darkened streets of Thebes, moving in small groups to avoid suspicion, they carried with them stolen documents detailing guard positions, maps of secret passages, and even a copy of the Pharaoh's personal schedule for the following week. But when they reached the meeting point, they found not their promised liberators, but a full century of Egyptian soldiers commanded by Amenemheb himself. The Assyrians they had trusted were nowhere to be seen. Later, the conspirators would learn that their supposed allies had been captured or killed days earlier, and that Egyptian forces had been using their meeting arrangements to identify every member of the conspiracy. The arrest was conducted with cold efficiency. No violence was necessary. The 73 conspirators, realizing they had been betrayed and outmaneuvered, offered no resistance. They were bound with rope and marched back to the palace in a long, silent procession that drew curious stares from early rising citizens, but no official explanation from the guards who escorted them. By dawn, all 73 were secured in a storage chamber deep beneath the palace, the same room where grain had once been kept, and where their first whispered conversations about freedom had taken place. They sat in darkness, still bound, waiting for a trial that would never come and an execution that would prove far more creative than anything they could have imagined. In the days following the arrest, the palace above continued its normal routines while 73 souls languished in darkness below. Kitchen work proceeded, despite the absence of familiar faces. Garden maintenance continued with replacement laborers hastily recruited from the city. The chambers that had once been cleaned by the conspirators were now tended by servants who had been deemed sufficiently loyal to trust with increased responsibilities. But those who remained free could not escape the weight of what had happened to their fellow servants. The official story, circulated by palace administrators, was simple and designed to discourage similar thoughts of rebellion. The missing 73 had been revealed as cowards who had fled their sacred duties in anticipation of Assyrian victory. They had abandoned their posts, stolen palace property, and disappeared into the desert like the worthless creatures they had always been beneath their facade of loyalty. Yet this explanation satisfied no one who had actually known the missing servants. Khaemwaset had been among the most dedicated workers in the palace, never missing a day of service even when illness left him barely able to stand. Neferet had been so conscientious about her duties that overseers often used her as an example to shame lazier servants. These were not people who would simply abandon everything they had known without compelling reason. The remaining servants began to notice other troubling details. The storage chamber where grain had once been kept remained sealed, with new locks installed and guards posted nearby. Strange sounds sometimes echoed from beneath the palace floors during the quiet hours before dawn. Some reported hearing what sounded like scratching or tapping, as if someone were trying to communicate through stone walls. More disturbing still were the changes in Vizier Amenemheb's behavior. The man who had always maintained perfect composure in public now seemed nervous, distracted. He increased the frequency of his inspections of the palace's lower levels, always accompanied by trusted guards who had been sworn to secrecy about whatever they witnessed during these visits. The few servants who worked near the sealed chamber reported that Amenemheb would sometimes stand outside the locked door for long periods, his ear pressed against the wood, as if listening for something specific. On several occasions, guards reported seeing him enter the chamber alone, remaining inside for hours, while strange sounds echoed through the stone corridors. Palace physicians were called to the lower levels with increasing frequency, always under escort, and always sworn to silence about their patients. They carried bags containing not the usual healing herbs and surgical instruments, but stranger supplies. Clay jars filled with water, baskets of bread that grew moldy before it could be consumed, and small oil lamps that burned briefly before being extinguished. The truth about what was happening in the sealed chamber began to emerge through fragments of overheard conversation and careful observation of who was allowed access to the lower levels. The 73 conspirators had not been executed. They had not been sold into slavery in distant lands. They had not even been imprisoned in the conventional sense, where prisoners might eventually expect trial, punishment, or release. Instead, they had been subjected to something far more calculated and cruel. Pharaoh Psamtik, upon learning of the conspiracy, had decided that public execution would only create martyrs whose memory might inspire future rebellions. Mass deportation would rid him of the immediate problem, but failed to serve as an adequate deterrent to other potential conspirators still serving in the palace. What was needed, Psamtik concluded, was an example that would be both terrifying and deniable. The 73 would simply disappear, becoming cautionary tales told in whispers rather than heroic figures celebrated in songs. But their disappearance would not be quick or merciful. It would be prolonged, allowing word of their fate to spread through the servant community in exactly the way that would prove most effective in preventing future conspiracies. The chamber had been modified specifically for this purpose. Iron chains, forged in the palace smithy under cover of darkness, had been anchored to the stone walls. Each conspirator was secured to a position just close enough to their companions to see and hear each other's suffering, but too far apart to offer physical comfort or assistance. Food and water were provided in quantities carefully calculated to prolong life while ensuring constant hunger and thirst. The conspirators were not starved quickly. They were allowed to weaken gradually, day by day, week by week, their conversations growing softer as their strength failed, their hopes for rescue or reprieve fading like lamp oil burning away drop by drop. Palace servants who had remained loyal were occasionally allowed to see the chamber, always under strict supervision and with stern warnings about the consequences of discussing what they witnessed. The message was clear. This was the fate that awaited anyone who placed their own desires above their sacred duty to the pharaoh. But even the most carefully planned psychological warfare can produce unintended consequences. The knowledge that 73 people were dying slowly beneath their feet began to affect the remaining palace staff in ways that Amenemheb had not anticipated. Productivity declined as servants struggled to concentrate on their tasks. Some requested transfers to other royal properties, claiming illness or family obligations. Others began making small offerings at local temples, praying for the souls of people they were not supposed to know were still dying. The very cruelty that was intended to prevent future rebellions began to generate exactly the kind of resentment and moral outrage that could fuel more serious resistance to royal authority. 3 weeks after the arrests, a young servant named Hekaib began to notice patterns in the palace's daily routines that others had overlooked. Hekaib worked in the lamp maintenance crew, responsible for keeping oil burning in the corridors and chambers throughout the massive complex. His duties required him to move through areas of the palace that most servants never saw, including storage rooms, administrative offices, and the narrow passages that connected different levels of the building. It was during his routine lamp inspections that Hekaib first observed the peculiar scheduling that surrounded the sealed chamber. Every morning, just before dawn, Vizier Amenemheb would descend to the lower levels accompanied by 2 guards and a palace physician named Kamhaset. They would remain below for exactly 1 hour, emerging with empty water jars and food baskets that had been full when they entered. More intriguingly, Hekaib noticed that the guards who accompanied these daily visits were rotated frequently, never serving more than 3 consecutive days on this particular duty. When he managed to strike up conversations with some of these guards, he learned that they had been specifically instructed not to discuss their assignments with anyone, including their own families. But secrets have a way of corroding even the most disciplined silence, and Hekaib was patient enough to wait for cracks to appear. After weeks of casual conversation and shared meals, he finally gained the confidence of a guard named Jay, who had been struggling with nightmares since his assignment to the lower levels. "They are still alive," Jay whispered one evening as they shared bread and beer in the guards' quarters. "All 73 of them, chained to the walls like animals, but still breathing, still conscious enough to recognize faces when we bring food and water." The revelation struck Hekaib like a physical blow. He had assumed, as most palace servants had, that the conspirators had been quietly executed and their bodies disposed of in the desert. The reality was somehow more horrifying than simple murder. It suggested a level of calculated cruelty that challenged everything he had been taught about royal justice and divine wisdom. Jay's description of the chamber became more detailed as his need to share the burden overcame his fear of punishment. The conspirators had been arranged in rows, each chained at a distance that prevented them from reaching each other, but allowed them to witness each other's gradual decline. They were provided with just enough sustenance to prolong their lives, but not enough to maintain their health or strength. "Some no longer speak," Jay continued, his voice barely audible above the crackling of the oil lamp that illuminated their conversation. "Others whisper constantly, but their words make no sense. A few still beg for mercy or ask about their families, but the vizier has forbidden us to respond to anything they say." The most disturbing aspect of Jay's account was his description of Vizier Amenemheb's behavior during these daily visits. Rather than displaying the detached professionalism expected of a senior administrator, Amenemheb appeared to take personal satisfaction in observing the conspirators' deterioration. He would walk slowly from person to person, studying their faces, sometimes asking the physician to examine particular individuals who seemed close to death. "He does not want them to die too quickly," Tejay explained. "When someone appears to be failing, the physician provides just enough care to keep them alive a little longer. It is as if the vizier is conducting some sort of experiment, testing how long human beings can survive under these conditions." Hekaib realized that he was now in possession of information that could get him killed, but he also understood that he could not simply ignore what he had learned. The knowledge that 73 people were suffering prolonged deaths beneath his feet made it impossible to continue his normal routines without feeling complicit in their torment. He began to develop his own network of information gathering, carefully cultivating relationships with servants who worked in different parts of the palace. From a kitchen worker, he learned that food portions for the lower levels had been calculated by the palace's chief scribe based on specific instructions about maintaining life while ensuring constant hunger. From a water carrier, he discovered that the daily allotment of water to the sealed chamber was barely sufficient to prevent death from dehydration. Most revealing of all was a conversation with Seneptify, an elderly servant who had worked in the palace for over 40 years, and who had access to records that documented unusual expenses and resource allocations. She showed Hekaib requisition orders for chains, locks, and construction materials that had been used to modify the storage chamber. The orders were signed by Amenemheb personally and carried notations indicating that the work was to be completed in absolute secrecy. The vizier planned this for weeks before the arrests, Seneptify explained, her weathered hands trembling as she showed Hekaib the papyrus documents. These requisitions were filed even before the conspiracy was discovered. He knew what he intended to do with them before they were captured. This revelation suggested something even more sinister than Hekaib had previously imagined. If Amenemheb had been preparing the torture chamber before the conspiracy was fully exposed, it raised questions about whether the entire plot had been allowed to develop specifically to justify the extreme punishment that followed. Had the conspirators been walking into a trap that was designed not just to capture them, but to create an opportunity for this particular form of psychological warfare against the remaining palace staff? Hekaib began to suspect that some of the supposed conspirators might have been innocent servants who had been deliberately included in the group to increase the number of victims and therefore the impact of the example being set. The round number of 73 seemed suspicious in itself. as if it had been chosen for symbolic rather than practical reasons. As days turned into weeks, Hekaib noticed changes in his fellow servants that suggested the psychological strategy was working exactly as intended. People spoke more quietly, avoided gathering in groups, and seemed constantly aware that they might be under observation. The easy camaraderie that had once characterized life in the servants' quarters was replaced by suspicious glances and careful words. But this atmosphere of fear also created opportunities for those willing to take risks in pursuit of truth or justice. The turning point came when Hekaib discovered that he was not the only palace servant investigating the fate of the 73 conspirators. During a late-night encounter in the palace's grain storage area, he nearly collided with Taweret, a laundry worker who had been moving through the darkened corridors with the same stealth he had been practicing for weeks. Their mutual surprise quickly gave way to a cautious conversation that revealed they had been conducting parallel investigations into the sealed chamber. Taweret had been tracking the movement of linens and clothing to the lower levels, noting that blood-stained and soiled garments were being brought up for cleaning on a regular basis. The quantities and types of stains suggested that the people wearing these clothes were experiencing severe physical deterioration. "They are dying slowly," Taweret whispered, her face barely visible in the light of the small oil lamp she carried. "But someone is keeping careful records of how they die. The physician brings back detailed notes after each visit, and these notes are being compiled into a formal document that the vizier reviews personally." Together, they began to piece together a picture of systematic torture that went far beyond simple imprisonment or even conventional execution. The conspirators were being used as subjects in what amounted to an experiment in human suffering, with their deaths being carefully documented for future reference. Their investigation took on new urgency when they learned from Jay that several of the chained prisoners had already died, their bodies removed during nighttime visits to the chamber. But rather than reducing the total number of victims, these deaths had prompted Amenemheb to order that the remaining conspirators be provided with slightly more food and water to prevent additional deaths until his documentation was complete. "He wants them all to die at approximately the same time," TJ explained during one of his increasingly frequent conversations with Hekaib. "The physician has been instructed to calculate exactly how much sustenance each person needs to survive until a specific date that the vizier has selected." The target date, they learned, was the anticipated arrival of Assyrian forces at the gates of Thebes. Amenemheb intended for the final deaths of the conspirators to coincide with the city's last stand against foreign conquest, creating a symbolic connection between betrayal and the destruction it supposedly brought upon Egypt. But this timeline also created an opportunity for those who wished to interfere with the vizier's plans. If the conspirators were being kept alive according to a careful schedule, then changes to their food, water, or medical care could disrupt that schedule in ways that might either hasten their deaths as an act of mercy or prolong their lives until rescue became possible. Hekaib and Taweret began recruiting other servants who had become aware of the situation and who were willing to take risks to either expose or sabotage what was happening in the sealed chamber. Their network grew to include Jehutihotep, a young man who worked with the palace's metal workers and who might be able to create tools for breaking chains, and Kentmin, a servant with access to the palace's medical supplies who could potentially provide either poison for a merciful death or medicine for prolonged survival. The group's planning was complicated by the need for absolute secrecy and by disagreements about their ultimate objectives. Some, like Taweret, believed that the most humane course would be to end the conspirators' suffering as quickly as possible. Others, including Hekaib, hoped that evidence of the torture could somehow be preserved and used to expose Amenemheb's cruelty to higher authorities or foreign allies who might intervene. Their debates were cut short by a development that none of them had anticipated. Kentmin, during one of his supply runs to the palace's medical stores, overheard a conversation between Vizier Amenemheb and a messenger who had arrived with urgent dispatches from the northern front. The Assyrian advance had been slowed by Egyptian resistance at Memphis, potentially delaying their arrival at Thebes by several weeks. This news threw Amenemhet's carefully calculated timeline into chaos. The conspirators had been maintained at specific levels of deprivation based on the assumption that they would need to survive for a predetermined number of days. If that period was extended significantly, some would die prematurely while others would need to be sustained longer than originally planned. More disturbing still was Amenemhet's response to this complication. Rather than simply adjusting the schedule, he decided to accelerate the final phase of his experiment. Orders were given for the daily rations to the sealed chamber to be reduced immediately, and the palace physician was instructed to document the effects of increased deprivation on the remaining survivors. "He has become obsessed with the project," Kentmin reported to the others. "I heard him tell the physician that this documentation will be his gift to future generations of Egyptian administrators. A complete guide to breaking the spirit of potential rebels through controlled suffering." The revelation that Amenemhet saw the torture as a scholarly exercise rather than simply punishment pushed several members of Hekai's network beyond the point of passive resistance. Jehuti-Hotep began working on crude tools that might be used to break chains or locks. Taweret started stealing small amounts of food from the kitchens to supplement whatever rations were being provided to the chamber. Kentmin acquired medicines that might ease pain or provide strength to those who were closest to death, but their efforts were hampered by the increased security that accompanied the acceleration of Amenemhet's timeline. Additional guards were posted near the lower levels, and access to the sealed chamber was restricted to an even smaller circle of trusted personnel. The daily visits were extended, with the vizier spending increasing amounts of time observing and documenting the deteriorating condition of his victims. The race against time had begun, but it was a race with stakes that none of the participants fully understood. The climax arrived not through careful planning, but through an act of desperate improvisation born from moral outrage. On the morning when Hekaib and his network had intended to begin their rescue attempt, they discovered that events had overtaken their preparations in the most horrifying way possible. Jay appeared in the servants' quarters before dawn, his face pale with shock and his hands trembling as he sought out Hekaib. "It is over," he whispered, pulling Hekaib aside to a shadowed alcove where their conversation would not be overheard. "Amenemhet has decided that the experiment has provided all the data he requires. Tonight, the remaining conspirators will be left without food or water until they die." The finality of this pronouncement struck Hekaib like a physical blow. After weeks of planning and preparation, they had run out of time just when their intervention might have made a difference. But Jay had more information that would transform desperation into desperate action. "The vizier has ordered me to unlock the chamber at sunset and remove the chains from the dead," Jay continued. "He wants the bodies arranged in specific positions for a final documentation session before they are disposed of in the desert. But there are still 17 alive, and some of them retain enough strength to speak." This unexpected opportunity presented both a chance for mercy and enormous risk. If Hekaib and his allies could somehow gain access to the chamber during the final documentation session, they might be able to end the suffering of the survivors quickly and perhaps preserve some record of what had happened. But such an attempt would almost certainly result in their own arrests and similar fates. The decision was made in a moment of shared understanding that required no discussion. Taweret nodded grimly when Hekaib explained the situation. Jehuti-Hotep gathered his improvised tools without hesitation. Kentmin collected a selection of poisons that could provide quick, painless deaths to those who were beyond saving. Their plan, hastily constructed and desperately risky, relied on the confusion that would accompany the vizier's final visit to the chamber. Jay would unlock the door as ordered, but he would also ensure that the lamp he carried would, accidentally, be extinguished, plunging the chamber into darkness. In that darkness, Hekaib and the others would enter through a service passage that Jehuti-Hotep had identified during his explorations of the palace's lower levels. As the sun set over Thebes, painting the western sky in shades of gold and red that would have seemed beautiful under other circumstances, the four conspirators made their way through passages that grew narrower and more oppressive with each step downward. The air became thick and stale, heavy with the smell of human waste and the sweet cloying odor of bodies that were slowly dying. When they reached the chamber, Jay had already unlocked the door and extinguished his lamp as planned. But nothing could have prepared them for what they encountered in the darkness beyond that door. The sounds alone were enough to break their hearts. Labored breathing from multiple sources, the soft clinking of chains as weakened arms shifted position, and occasional whispers that were barely recognizable as human speech. Hekaib lit a small oil lamp with shaking hands, and the feeble light revealed a scene that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. The 73 conspirators had been reduced to 17 skeletal figures, their skin stretched tight over prominent bones, their eyes sunken deep into their skulls. Some sat upright against the walls, their chains keeping them from collapsing completely. Others lay on their sides, too weak to maintain any other position. But what struck Hekaib most forcefully was that some of these dying people still possessed the will to communicate. A woman he recognized as Neferet turned her head toward the light and whispered, "Please, water," in a voice like wind through dried reeds. A man whose name he had never learned but whose face was familiar from years of shared labor, reached out with one trembling hand, his chains clanking softly as he tried to gesture toward his companions. Tell our families," another voice managed, though Hekaib could not identify its source in the dim light. "Tell them we tried to choose freedom." The moment of horror stretched into eternity, but it was broken by the sound of footsteps echoing down the stone corridor outside. Vizier Amenemheb was approaching with his guards and physician for the final documentation session. There was no time for the careful mercy that Hekaib had planned, no opportunity for the dignified intervention he had imagined. Instead, he and his companions were forced to make impossible choices in a matter of seconds. Kentman moved quickly among the survivors, offering sips of water mixed with swift-acting poison to those who seemed closest to death and most eager to escape their suffering. Taware used her hands to provide what comfort she could, stroking faces and whispering words of forgiveness and peace. Jehutihotep worked frantically with his improvised tools to break chains, though he knew that freeing the survivors would only expose them to execution when Amenemheb arrived. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the sound of voices discussing the documentation procedures that were about to begin. Hekaib realized that they had perhaps 1 minute before discovery, and that discovery would mean not only their own deaths, but the failure of their mission to provide any mercy or dignity to the dying conspirators. In that final minute, he made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of fleeing or attempting to hide, he began speaking in a clear voice that carried to every corner of the chamber, recording the names of as many conspirators as he could remember and the details of how they had died. If he was going to be captured, he would ensure that his final act was to bear witness to what had happened in this place of horror. When Vizier Amenemheb entered the chamber with his guards and physician, he found not the carefully arranged scene of controlled death that he had planned to document, but a tableau of chaos that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. 17 emaciated figures lay dead or dying, their chains broken or loosened, surrounded by 4 palace servants who made no attempt to flee or deny their presence. Hekaib stood in the center of the chamber, still speaking the names of the dead in a voice that echoed off the stone walls with the resonance of a funeral chant. Kaimwaset, son of Amenhotep, who served in this palace for 23 years. Neferet, daughter of Senwosret, who was sold into service at age 12 and never knew freedom until this moment. Seneb, who noticed the fear in the guard's eyes and dared to hope that liberation might come from foreign conquerors. The vizier's shock quickly transformed into rage that his carefully planned conclusion had been disrupted by servants who had no right to interfere with royal justice. But his anger was tempered by a growing realization that the situation had become far more complicated than a simple matter of unauthorized access to a restricted area. The 4 intruders had not come to rescue the conspirators or to steal valuable items from the chamber. They had come to bear witness, to ensure that the deaths of the 73 would be remembered as the murders they were, rather than the justified punishments that official records would claim. Their presence transformed Amenemheb's private experiment into a public testimony that could not be suppressed or denied. The physician, Kamaset, stood frozen in the doorway, his medical bag forgotten as he stared at the scene before him. For weeks, he had participated in the slow murder of these people, telling himself that he was simply following orders and that the responsibility lay with those who gave the commands rather than those who carried them out. But seeing the broken chains and the peaceful expressions on the faces of those who had just died, he was forced to confront the reality of his own participation in systematic torture. Amenemheb's first instinct was to order the immediate execution of the 4 witnesses, but he quickly realized that such action would only create more problems. The servants who had entered the chamber were not random intruders who could disappear without explanation. They were known figures in the palace community, with friends and responsibilities that would be noticed if they suddenly vanished. Their deaths would require explanations that might draw attention to the very activities that Amenemheb had worked so hard to keep secret. More troubling still was the realization that these 4 servants had clearly been planning their intervention for some time. They possessed detailed knowledge about the conspiracy, the chamber, and the schedule of visits that could only have been gathered through an extensive network of informants. If they were eliminated, there was no guarantee that their knowledge would die with them. Taweret, still kneeling beside one of the dead conspirators, looked up at the vizier with eyes that held no fear, only exhaustion and moral clarity. "We are not the criminals here," she said quietly. "We came to offer mercy to people who were dying slowly for the crime of hoping for freedom. If that makes us traitors, then we accept whatever punishment you believe is appropriate." Her words hung in the air like an accusation that could not be answered without admitting guilt. Amenemheb found himself in the unprecedented position of being morally challenged by a laundry worker and discovering that he had no satisfactory response to her challenge. The standoff was broken by an unexpected intervention from Guard J, who had been standing silent and motionless since the vizier's arrival. "My lord," he said, his voice barely steady, "the Assyrian armies have been spotted approaching the city walls. Their advance scouts are already within sight of the palace." This news transformed the situation yet again. The approaching conquest meant that Amenemheb's documentation project was no longer relevant, and that his carefully planned timeline had been rendered meaningless by events beyond his control. More immediately, it meant that very soon there might be new authorities in Thebes who would be very interested in examining evidence of the previous administration's methods of maintaining order. Hekaib, who had continued his recitation of names throughout the confrontation, finally fell silent as the implications of the guard's announcement became clear. The Assyrian conquest that the original 73 conspirators had hoped would bring them freedom was now imminent. But it had arrived too late to save any of them from the consequences of their hope. In the days that followed, as Assyrian forces surrounded Thebes and began negotiations for the city's surrender, the palace became a place of frantic activity and desperate preparation. Officials burned documents, hid valuable objects, and made plans for either resistance or collaboration with the new rulers. In the chaos of these preparations, the 4 servants who had witnessed the final moments in the chamber found themselves in an unexpected position of influence. Amenemheb, facing the prospect of Assyrian investigation into his administration's methods, discovered that he needed the silence and cooperation of people who had previously been beneath his notice. The testimony of Hekaib, Taweret, Jehutihotep, and Kentmin could either condemn him as a torturer and murderer or support a narrative that presented him as a loyal administrator who had used harsh but necessary methods to maintain order in difficult times. The negotiation that followed was conducted in whispers and implied threats rather than formal discussions. The 4 servants were offered their freedom, modest financial compensation, and positions in the new administration if they agreed to describe the fate of the 73 conspirators as a justified response to treason rather than systematic torture. In exchange, they would be expected to forget the details of how the deaths had actually occurred and to support whatever official explanation was deemed appropriate by the new authorities. But the moral clarity that had driven them to enter the Chamber of Horrors could not be so easily compromised. Hekaib, speaking for the group, provided an answer that surprised everyone present. "We will not lie about what we witnessed," he said firmly. "But neither will we speak of it unless we are directly asked by legitimate authorities who have the right to demand such testimony." This response satisfied no one completely, but it provided a temporary solution that allowed everyone to avoid immediate consequences while preserving future options. Amenemheb was not protected from potential accusations, but neither was he immediately condemned by hostile witnesses. The 4 servants were not rewarded for their silence, but neither were they punished for their intervention. When the Assyrians finally entered Thebes and began establishing their administration of the conquered city, they showed little interest in investigating the details of how their predecessors had maintained order. Their primary concerns were securing valuable resources, establishing tribute payments, and identifying local administrators who could help them govern effectively. The story of 73 chained servants who had died in a palace chamber seemed like a minor historical footnote compared to the larger questions of managing a vast empire. The chamber itself was sealed and forgotten, its existence known only to a shrinking number of people who had personal reasons for keeping the knowledge to themselves. The official records spoke vaguely of servants who had fled during the final days of Egyptian rule, their fate unknown, and their names gradually forgotten by a population dealing with the more immediate challenges of foreign occupation. But among the surviving palace servants, and in the families of those who had died in chains, the story was preserved in whispered conversations and carefully guarded memories. Children learned about relatives who had dreamed of freedom and died for that dream. Parents warned their offspring about the dangers of hoping for more than their station in life allowed. Years passed, then decades, then generations. The Assyrian occupation gave way to Persian rule, which eventually yielded to Macedonian conquest under Alexander the Great. Each change of administration brought new opportunities and new dangers, but none brought justice for the 73 who had died beneath the palace of Thebes. Yet their story endured, passed down through families and communities like a cautionary tale about the price of rebellion and the cruelty of absolute power. It became a reminder that even in the darkest moments of oppression, there were always some people willing to risk everything to bear witness to injustice and offer comfort to the suffering. The palace chamber where they died remained sealed, its chains still anchored to stone walls, its floor still stained with the evidence of prolonged torture. And in the silence of that forgotten space, the echo of their voices seemed to linger, speaking the names of the dead and demanding that their story be remembered, no matter how many years might pass or how many empires might rise and fall above their unmarked graves. Tell me in the comments what you think about this untold story from ancient Egypt. Do you believe that even in the darkest periods of history, there were always people willing to stand up for what was right, even when it meant risking everything? And don't forget to subscribe for more hidden stories from the ancient world that reveal the eternal struggles between power and justice, cruelty and compassion that continue to shape our world today.